Yeah, so I thought in the spirit of DeFi maximalist claims that I would make a maximalist claim about, in this case, a particular financial instrument. And what I claim is that a call spread, which is a call option and a sold call option, considered together as a structure, that you can take that and make special cases to make pretty much every other financial object that we have a name for. This claim can probably be made about a few different basic constructors, but for reasons that I hope to go into, I think call spreads are the most natural one. If I can move my slides. So specifically, I'll go through what a call spread is and then how we can take special cases of it to make these lists of progeny. We can make call and put options, European call and put options. We can make futures. We can make binary options, which are 1-0 options, state options, which are a generalized kind of 1-0 options, prediction markets, obviously. And also, we can make collateralized loans, which is something which, if we're able to have a language to talk about the collateral and the margining of a derivative, then we can construct what we would consider normal, very simple collateralized loans as a special case of these call spreads. We can also very naturally do things like insurance markets. Insurance is best, most insurance contracts are best described by something which looks like the structure of a call spread, as we'll see. So a very generic description of a derivative, which is even more general than a call spread, has these set of things. And by specifying each of these, we can create all of our examples. There's a set of underlying states, underlying things that can happen, which will affect the derivative value. In the example here, it's just all positive values can happen. Perhaps it's an underlying price, the price of oil, or the price of the S&P, or the price of an exchange rate. There is an expiry. You might have something expiring in December. There is a value function, and in the picture here, the value function is just this flat function, which then is linear up and then flat again, and that defines how much the derivative is worth at expiry, depending on how much the underlying value is worth at expiry. So underlying on the x-axis, the value of the contract on the y-axis. There will be a currency that the underlying is naturally expressed in. And in this case, it might be US dollars. And there will be a currency that the collateral that we put up against this contract will be expressed in this case, maybe just US dollars. There will be a margin function. So with any derivative has some liability that both sides will generate. They'll either make money or they'll lose money, and they'll have to put up some amount of money at the start in order to satisfy the possible losses that they'll make. And so the collateral that they put up against it, one of the simplest rules for that is that they both put up the maximum they can possibly lose in the contract. There are other ways that the margin can work, but that's the idea of a margin, is how we specify how much collateral is being put up at different times. And there's a liability function which specifies how the value of the contract changes over time. So this is the picture that we'll look at. We'll take this picture, which is actually a picture of a call spread, and and we'll bend it around a few different ways in order to make all the things that we've claimed, and then I have a couple of general comments on how these things kind of hang together inside exchanges. So in the picture, the size of these blocks, there's blue and green blocks. The width isn't important, it's just there to draw the eye, but the height is important. So we're saying here that the one side of the contract, which we'll call the long side of the contract, is putting up this amount of this green amount of collateral, and the other side of the contract is putting up the blue amount of collateral, and those sum to the total to the height of that value function, which means that the function will be worth some amount, and that will be split between the two at the end. So, for example, we might have a contract which looks like this: starts at 20, ends at 30, and what it's saying is that if the underlying value is worth less than 20, the contract's worth 0. If the underlying value is worth greater than 30, the contract is worth 10, and then it's linear between those 2 points. So the total value of the contract that is being split up in the contract will be divided between these two sides will be $10. The two counterparties get together at the start inside an exchange or some kind of an auction or price discovery mechanism, and they say, I'll put up one says I'll put up $3, and the other says I'll put up $7. They're both, that's their margin, their collateral for the contract, and then the contract plays out, and at the end it'll be determined who gets that $10 or what proportion of that $10. We have like we use the notation, this plus notation, to indicate the maximum of the number in 0. So you could say this is like the state minus 20 minus the state minus 30, and that gives us this piecewise linear function. In general, we can put some notation to it. We use K1s and K2s. We'll, instead of this initial value, 3, we call that V0. I won't go too much into notation, but just so that we can contextualize this. V0 is the value at trade time. What the two parties actually see. This is the price of the contract that they'll see. Yeah, that's a basic call spread. So what can we do with that? Well, one thing we can do with it is take the two strikes, K1 and K2, and make them approach each other, make them equal each other. And when we do that, we get a vertical function here, this step function. This is called a binary contract, and what it says is that if the price is if the price is less than 100, the contract is worth 0. If the price is greater than 100, the contract will be worth 1. So $1 will get split up between the long and the short side of the contract. And in this here, we're saying that in order to enter this contract, one side puts up 20 cents and the other side puts up 80 cents. They're both collateralized to the maximum possible loss, and that will be split. Either $1 will go to the long side or $1 will go to the short side, and the other side will get nothing. This kind of contract has a nice side effect, and that is that the price of the contract in this 20 cents is something like a probability. You can kind of say that the probability that the market is saying, given this arrangement between these two parties, is that there's a 20% probability that the price will be less than 100 and an 80% probability that it'll be greater than 100. So as with prediction markets, the price is reflective of a probability, given that the maximum value is 1. So that's the first thing we can do. The second, we can kind of, say, use this in notation. We'll call this V0, our initial price, and we'll call this 1 minus V0, the same in the example. Second thing we can do, we can restrict the states. So now we have, same as the previous contract, this binary contract, but we now say that instead of all possible states, it's now, it can only be 0 or 1. And this is very familiar as a prediction market. We're saying that there's a 0 state where the horse doesn't win, and there's a 1 state where the horse does win. So if I'm betting at the track on Mr. Pickington, who's a horse in the 3rd race, then I might put up 30 cents to try to win $1. Same as the binary contract, but again, now there are no intermediate states. There's only 2. And again, we're not dwelling on it, but the strike and the collateral currency are the same. We'll change that in a second. So in general, V0, 1 minus V0 for prediction markets. Now we get to something interesting. Now let's say that I'll say that the K1, my first strike, I take that all the way to 0, and K2, I take to infinity. And so now I don't have the flat parts of my function, I just have a straight line. And this straight line is called a futures contract. Now the issue with the futures contract is that there's a maximum loss for the short side, but there's an unbounded possible loss for the long side. So it isn't possible to fully collateralize a futures contract simply because the price can just go up and up and up, and the short contract will have to pay more and more and more. And so what happens on exchanges is that we have this process of margining. The idea being that I put up some amount, some fraction of the contract value or some other, maybe just a fixed value. And as the contract value changes, I'm required to put up more collateral, or I might receive collateral back. And that process, the value that I'm required to put up is the margin function. And if I breach the margin, then the contract is entitled to terminate, so that it's able to sell out, and I might have some kind of a penalty. And the contract, then the person can simply try to find another counterparty. If that buffer is large enough, then futures trading is safe. But in general, it requires a lot of, the exchanges have to be careful on how much margin they require. So in this case, the futures contract is for 100, which we're saying that we think the price of this is going to be 100 at expiry, more or less. And each side puts up $10. So we put up 10% of the contract value. And so the contract can move a full $10 in either direction, and we still will have enough margin, but then we implement margin calls and make sure that there's $10 buffer, not just $10 in total there for each side. If we have something like a futures contract, we have to have an additional oracle. We have an oracle for the state, for the outcome on our x-axis, but now we need to have an oracle for the value of the derivative at any time. And that can be, sometimes we can just use whatever the state happens to be now. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, but the price that we pay for futures is, 1, that we have to have margining, and 2, that we probably have a second oracle. In general, we just put some letters to that instead of numbers. Now call option. So we have, if we simply make K2 the second strike unbounded, then we just have a traditional call option, which is a flat payoff and then a 45-degree line. And here, the long side puts up the price of the option. The short side, we have question marks in here. not because it's not known, but because it's slightly, there's a few different ways that you can do it, and it's slightly involved. The idea is that the same as with all margining, that the short side puts up enough so that there's a buffer if there are changes in the values of the contract, and there's time to ask them for more collateral before shutting them out of their contract. But it's messy, and there's a few different ways to do it. Hence, that's the question marks. A put option is a structure with a flat payoff and a straight line in the other direction. We construct this. We're entitled to construct something of this shape because we take a call option and we minus the future. And if you have the call option payoff and minus the future payoff, we get this structure of payoff. We have slightly more exotic thing, a state market, beloved by economists because there's a theoretical underpinning of some certain types of macroeconomics which talks about everything being a function of state prices for events, and we might have an event of the underlying price between being 10 and 20, with a maximum with a payoff of 1, and that gives us a state market. The way we've constructed things, this is a binary, one binary minus another binary, and we still haven't touched strike and collateral currency, but this is good. So we have pretty much all synthetic markets now that you would usually you see on a derivatives exchange, call and put options, binaries, and futures, and they're fairly simple constructions. And you can use this to implement how things are generally implemented is easily done in this way. General state market, V0, 1 minus V0. Now we turn to a collateralized loan. This is a bit crazy. So we take our call spread, we say that the first strike is now equal to 0, and we actually the strikes here are now arbitrary, but we say that there's only one state. There's only which is only 1. So the value function is just flat. It can only ever be 1 no matter what happens to the underlying state, which is to say that there's no underlying state. There's just 1. Just the value will be 1 at the end. And what this is a loan. The contract says, I will pay $1 at the end. My liability is $1 at the end of this period, and it's $1 no matter what happens. And that is recognizable as a loan, as the way we would think of a loan. Of course, the collateral, if I have a loan and I put up collateral, I can't put up collateral in the same currency. I can't put up $100 US of collateral to receive $100 US loan. I'll put up $100 in Australian dollars or Bitcoin in order to receive that loan. And here's where striking collateral currency matters. So we might say that the strike currency is US dollars, it's a US dollar loan, but it's being margined in Bitcoin. And the margin function, and this again is familiar from the way that we do vaults, that we might say we would demand to have 1.2 times the value of the loan in Bitcoin at the start in order to have the loan. The reason why the short margin we have here is 90 cents, and the reason it's 90 cents is because there's an interest rate. The lender, the short side, puts up 90 cents and then receives $1 at expiry. and they do that because they demand to receive an interest rate in order to induce them to make the loan. That interest rate will be partly just they're determined by their discount function, but it'll also be determined by how likely they believe that the other side is to default, or that how likely it is for the price to move fast enough so that they won't be able to liquidate the collateral fast enough to satisfy the loan. So yeah, it's a call spread. Maybe it's trivially a call spread, but we can take this same idea of having different strike and collateral currencies. We could take it to any one of our previous. We could do the same for futures or call spreads, or binaries or what have you, and we would have the same kind of dynamic where now the collateral we require an over collateralization in the collateral currency in order to satisfy our liability in the strike currency. So that's our collateralized loan. In general, we give these things parameters. We have like an over collateralization amount for the loan, and our V0 is now a representation of our discount rate. So now we have one of the reasons why this construction is nice is we have at the beginning prices being represented as probabilities, and if we have enough of those prices, then we have probability distributions, and we have families of probability distributions of the state at different points in time, and that is the richest possible information set that we can have about the underlying state, to have a probability distribution of what it's going to be at any possible future point in time. So we have that, and we also have discount rates, which is, say, interest rates. And through this mechanism, we're able to have discount rates for loans at any expiry, and that gives us a yield curve. And those two things together, these family of probability distributions and a yield curve, is what people would kind of see as the cornerstone pricing objects for finance. Once we have enough of them, then we can price other things from them. We can also do what's called spanning. So if I take a state option, which is effectively just looks like a little block, then I can add it to other blocks and build shapes. I can build shapes that look like functions. And indeed, you can kind of see almost obviously, you can build any shape of function that you desire. If I wanted to create something which looked like a sine wave, I would be able to create that as a limit of smaller and smaller blocks. And so this is very, very helpful. It means we can transfer, if I know the price of a series of call spreads, then I can know the price of a series of blocks. And if I know the price of a series of blocks, I can know the price of a series of anything which is built from those blocks. And that's very useful, because it means that if I come up with a strange shaped pricing function for strange shaped value function, then the price of that can be quickly known and determined and hedged in the market for these other securities in a clear way. So that's broadly what I wanted to get into, apart from a couple of kind of peripheral comments. So we have, again, these choices. For our underlying states, we can have a discrete set of states, or we can have a continuous set of states. They can be all possible real numbers, or they can be all integers, or whatever we like. In the case of prediction markets, there'll be ones and zeros for the states. We can have an expiry. We have to have an expiry. We can construct perpetual futures and perpetual options. But those things are really constructions which use the fixed expiry versions and then add a pooling element on top. And so it's best to think about them as fixed expiry first, and then we can construct perpetuals if we wish. We have a value function. Flat value function is a loan. Linear value function is a future. A piecewise linear function is an option. There we can do non-linear functions as well. Once we have call spreads, then we can create other non-linear ones in this spanning manner. For collateral, which we can choose that it's either the same as what our strike is measuring in the same currency, or a different one in the case of loans, or if we want to do cross-currency collateral. The margin functions, maximum loss is the default margin function, where in DeFi, obviously the most desirable, that no matter what, you're going to have enough collateral to cover this loan, to cover the liability that the derivative creates. Of course, this isn't possible in the case of futures or call options, or indeed for loans. And so we have to have a margining mechanism, which is a function which looks at what the state currently is and tells us how much buffer we need to put up in order to satisfy that. If we don't make that margin, if we don't keep that buffer, then the contract will exit. It will liquidate the collateral, and there might be some kind of penalty to whoever has not put up the margin in time. And there is a liability function. The liability function usually is just a change in value. There's the difference in the V0 minus whatever V ends up being, but it can be more general. And so that's it for our set of things. You can go through, and any contract you can imagine, we make these set of choices, and we take a call spread, and we make a special case of whatever our building block is. A peripheral comment for our call spread. Our most general version of which is a call spread, which has a different collateral and strike currency, and is partially collateralized in the sense that it's not maximum loss. We only put up part collateral. We end up having three oracles: the state oracle, which determines what the state is; the currency oracle, which determines the exchange rate between my collateral currency and a strike currency; and a value oracle for determining how the margin should think about the value of the derivative over time. And that can be very hard. If we have a traded price that we can see, there's a liquid market which trades in depth, then we're able to take prices from that and use those as the value oracle. Sometimes what we can do, if we don't have a deep market, then we can use a parametric margining mechanism. And that is simply, a good example is for a loan. If we don't know the current interest rates will fluctuate on a loan over time, but we might look at a nearby loan, a loan which has a similar characteristic. We might figure out from what the interest rate is on that loan, and we would use that interest rate from this other nearby loan in order to margin our current loan. In the case of options, we can use option pricing formula. So I don't know how a particular option should be priced, but I can say, well, it's going to be between these two values given this option pricing formula under a plausible set of scenarios. And so I can use the pricing models as ways to get bounds to have sufficiently safe amounts of collateral. And that's the usual approach. for when we don't have a liquid market. So which is to say that it's hard, but it's doable. It's just a matter of thinking a bit creatively about it. There's a couple of other issues I just wanted to quickly touch on. First one, liquidation penalties. If we don't make margin, then it's usually good to have some kind of a penalty to incentivize people to make sure that they have enough margin. In the case where you have both people have a symmetric risk of not making margin, sometimes we can create a penalty or a set of penalties which will give them balanced incentives not to default. So there's a whole kind of rabbit hole of thinking about what kind of liquidation penalties, depending on the relative amount of risk that each side it poses to the other in the contract of defaulting. The span margining is if I'm trading lots of derivatives at the same time, then instead of looking at the maximum loss for a particular derivative, it could be very desirable to look at the maximum loss across a spectrum of a span of derivatives that I hold. I might be long and short different kinds of call options on the same underlying, for example. And if I construct a margin function which is aware of the other derivatives, then it's much more efficient, and it's much easier for market makers to participate and for everybody to participate in a way that is still safe. And that means that the contracts have to know of each other's existence. They don't have to. The simplest version, they don't. But if we want to do proper exchanges, then we do need that. Margin insurance, and this is another kind of rabbit hole, but something worthwhile mentioning. In said the main derivatives exchange in the world at the moment is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and the main service that they provide is to be the counterparty to everybody's trade. If I go there and trade a future on crude oil, then I don't worry about the risk that whoever I traded with won't make margin. The exchange takes on that risk for me, and that's what they get their exchange fee for. For taking on the risk that some amount of people will, the price will move so much and the buffers will be insufficient, and they will have to make good on that trade. And so they hold capital against that contingency. It is possible to do what exchanges do to essentially provide that insurance against margin default in a decentralized way. And as a quick sketch, it's just the same as with an exchange. I take a pool of capital. Somebody says, "Well, we're happy to put up this pool of money," and in this well-defined set of circumstances, that the price moves sufficiently so that this person is out of margin, we're able to we'll come in and we'll make good on that contract. That liability itself is a special kind of option and can be priced in the same manner as the options on the underlying states. It's, again, just to mention it, partially because we're doing a paper on this topic, specifying how an exchange we can get the same outcome and the same safety that you have on an exchange, but in a decentralized way with margin insurance. And finally, we haven't talked about path-dependent derivatives. All our derivatives have only been, the value function is only determined at the end. It's possible to have derivatives that, and this is the exception to my universalist claim that call spreads can make everything, and that is that there are some derivatives which are dependent on the price at each point in time. And for those we need a slightly slightly more complicated construction. And I think I'll end it there, and see if Rowan is still on the line.
Thanks, Joe. And so as always, please do send questions into YouTube. Feel free to connect with us on Discord and send questions as well. We know that a lot of you are watching these videos asynchronously, so we are still around, obviously, for the next 2 weeks and forever after that. If you want to engage with us on Discord, Joe is an active member of the team, and we can reach out and get his assistance when you guys do have questions. So we'll leave it for a few seconds and see if any come in, and otherwise happy to end it here and bring people back on at noon for Chris Hibbert's presentation on actually implementing the call spread in Agoric. So we did have one question just came in, Joe. So the pricing for insurance for the margin, what does that cost?
So the risk that's being priced is that the price will jump more than the buffer, more than the margin, over the period of time in which you're not able to liquidate. So maybe like you have there's a minute period that you're not able to do anything as the price changes. And so if I have a very short-term call option on with a strike price equal to the value of the liability, and which I can determine at each point in time, the value of that option, whatever it happens to be, is the value of the margin insurance. The whole sequence of insurance is a series of forward starting options, because we don't know what the strike will be at any point in time. So that's generally called a cliquet, and it's just a series of options which have strikes that we don't know yet, but will be determined in the future, and they're determined at each point.
That pricing would be independent of the individual parties in the transaction, right? It would be defined primarily by got it.
Yes.
Great. So that would be something that someone could implement across their system and not have to worry about an individual. Yes. Great. Okay. And with that, I think, as I said, let's pull questions into Discord and we can continue the conversation. So thank you very much, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ron. Cheers.